kidding and the ribbing about getting his hair cut and all of that. He took it all like a drum major.
Before his death, legendary TV host Ed Sullivan dropped a bombshell. He revealed the 6 singers he hated the most. This was the man who introduced America to icons, launched careers, and ruled Sunday nights for decades. Yet behind the smiles and applause, Sullivan carried grudges that shocked even his closest colleagues. From rock and roll rebels to unstoppable soul pioneers, his private disdain clashed with the very stars who changed music forever. Why did Sullivan despise these performers so intensely? And how did their defiance shake up television history? Stick with us as we uncover the names, the feuds, and the untold stories of Sullivan's most hated singers. And before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss the secrets behind entertainment's biggest legends. When it came to Elvis Presley, Ed Sullivan's feelings were complicated and often hostile. At first, Sullivan wanted nothing to do with the young rock star. He was horrified by Elvis's hip-shaking energy, his raw vocals, and the tidal wave of teenage hysteria he provoked. To Sullivan, who built his reputation on a clean, family-friendly variety show, Elvis represented everything he feared: rebellion, sexuality, and the breakdown of traditional values. In 1956, Elvis had already shocked America with appearances on other programs. On The Milton Berle Show, he performed Hound Dog with exaggerated gyrations, and conservative audiences exploded with outrage. Clergymen called him vulgar. Hands called him dangerous. Sullivan joined the chorus, going so far as to declare publicly that Presley would never appear on his stage. But ratings spoke louder than morality. The Elvis craze was pulling in millions of young viewers, and Sullivan's own show risked being left behind. Reluctantly, and for the enormous fee of $50,000, an unheard-of sum at the time, Sullivan reversed himself and invited Elvis for 3 appearances. Yet the hostility lingered. Sullivan demanded that Elvis be filmed only from the waist up, terrified that his scandalous movements would tarnish the show's image. When Presley finally walked onto the Ed Sullivan stage in September 1956, 60 million Americans tuned in, 82% of the TV audience. Even with restrictions, Elvis lit up the screen. By the time he returned for later appearances, Sullivan softened his tone in public, even calling him a fine boy. But insiders knew the truth. Sullivan never trusted Presley. He resented the chaos, the controversy, and the cultural power Elvis carried. Ironically, the very performer Sullivan tried to suppress became the king of rock and roll, using Sullivan's platform as his coronation. It was a clash of generations, traditional television versus unstoppable youth culture, and though Sullivan hated Elvis, history crowned Presley the victor. But Elvis wasn't the only star who defied Sullivan's authority. The next name on his hate list refused to back down, and it ended in sabotage. If Elvis represented the battle between popularity and morality, Buddy Holly embodied something even more dangerous to Ed Sullivan: defiance. By the late 1950s, Holly and his band, the Crickets, were rising fast. With songs like Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day, they had already captured the hearts of teenagers across America. A performance on The Ed Sullivan Show promised to catapult them to the next level. But what should have been a career milestone quickly turned into a bitter feud. The tension began before Holly even set foot on stage. Scheduled to perform their hit, Oh Boy, Holly was stunned when Sullivan demanded a change. The host considered the lyrics, "All of my love, all of my kissing. You don't know what you've been a-missing." Too suggestive for his family-friendly broadcast. By today's standards, it seems laughably tame. But to Sullivan, it was a breach of decency. He insisted Holly pick a cleaner song. Holly refused. Calm, firm, and unyielding, he told Sullivan the band would play Oh Boy or nothing at all. That single act of defiance infuriated Sullivan, a man who expected artists to obey his every directive. From that moment, the atmosphere turned icy. Backstage, Holly was treated with disdain, and when the Crickets performed live on January 26, 1958, Sullivan allegedly had the sound levels turned down to sabotage the band. Viewers at home noticed the performance felt strangely muted, but Holly's energy and charisma still shone through. The audience in the studio roared. Teenagers watching at home loved it, and Buddy Holly cemented himself as a rebellious figure who would not be censored. Yet Sullivan never forgave him. The host snubbed him afterward and vowed never to invite him back. For Holly, the clash revealed something larger: the growing divide between youth-driven rock and establishment gatekeepers. He had stood his ground, and even though his life was tragically cut short, that night on Sullivan's stage became part of his legend, a symbol of rock and roll's refusal to be tamed. But Buddy Holly wasn't alone. Another young performer, Bob Dylan, would soon face Sullivan's world of censorship, and his response shocked the industry even more. If Buddy Holly challenged Sullivan with defiance, Bob Dylan challenged him with silence by walking away entirely. In 1963, Dylan was only 21 years old, but was already becoming a powerful voice in American culture. With his harmonica, his ragged voice, and his biting lyrics, he was giving shape to a restless generation. Landing a spot on the Ed Sullivan Show should have been the ultimate break. Millions of viewers, a chance to step from folk clubs into the national spotlight. For most young artists, it was a dream come true. For Dylan, it became a moment of confrontation. Dylan planned to perform Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues, a satirical song mocking the far-right paranoia of the John Birch Society. Its humor was sharp, its politics unmistakable, and Dylan delivered it with a wink that said more than any speech could. During rehearsal, Sullivan himself seemed amused. He reportedly had no objections, even offering Dylan quiet encouragement. But just before the live broadcast, CBS lawyers stepped in. They warned that the song could invite lawsuits, or worse, outrage from conservative viewers. Dylan was told to change his tune or drop it. This was a crossroads. Countless artists before had bowed to Sullivan's demands, choosing exposure over integrity. But Dylan wasn't wired that way. Calm but firm, he declared, "If I can't play my song, I'm not going to play at all." And with that, he walked off. The stunned producers scrambled. Sullivan himself looked powerless, and the story exploded in the press. What could have been a setback became a defining moment. Headlines praised Dylan's courage, framing him as a truth-teller, unwilling to be silenced by corporate TV. Far from damaging his career, the clash boosted his reputation, cementing him as more than a singer. He was now a cultural rebel. Ironically, Sullivan admired Dylan's talent and later expressed regret at how the network forced his hand. But the damage and the legend was done. Dylan's refusal became an anthem in itself, echoing the message of his own songs. Authority could be challenged. If Dylan shook Sullivan with politics, the next act would rattle him with pure chaos. Four young men from Liverpool who turned television upside down. If Bob Dylan's refusal left Sullivan reeling, the arrival of the Beatles nearly overwhelmed him. In February 1964, Ed Sullivan stood at the center of one of the most important nights in television history. More than 73 million Americans tuned in as four mop-topped lads from Liverpool performed live. It was the night Beatlemania officially invaded the United States. But while Sullivan smiled stiffly into the cameras, behind the curtain he felt both awed and unnerved. Sullivan had stumbled upon the Beatles almost by accident. On a trip through London's Heathrow Airport in 1963, he witnessed hundreds of screaming teenagers swarming to catch a glimpse of the band. The scene reminded him of the frenzy once caused by Elvis Presley, and Sullivan knew he had to act quickly. He booked the Beatles for 3 consecutive appearances, still unsure if America would embrace them. What followed shattered every expectation. Girls shrieked until microphones were barely audible. Boys studied their haircuts and guitars. Parents scowled at what they called noise. Yet on stage, John, Paul, George, and Ringo delivered flawless harmonies and playful charm that electrified a nation. Sullivan, always calculating, recognized the ratings gold. But in private, he was unsettled. He found their haircuts ridiculous, disliked Lennon's sharp wit, and bristled at the chaos they inspired. For Sullivan, who prided himself on order and family decorum, the Beatles represented disorder. Their humor was cheeky, their energy uncontrollable, and their fans impossible to restrain. Technicians worked frantically to adjust sound levels, worried the broadcast would collapse under the hysteria. And Sullivan, ever the gatekeeper, worried this was a phenomenon he couldn't contain. Yet he couldn't deny their power. The Beatles brought audiences unlike anything he had ever seen. For all his discomfort, he leaned into the storm because ratings mattered more than personal taste. Still, those around him recalled how uneasy he remained, privately skeptical of whether this kind of frenzy belonged on his stage. But if the Beatles shook him with mass hysteria, the next performer shook him with sheer force, an unstoppable soul singer who refused to tone himself down for anyone, not even Ed Sullivan. If the Beatles rattled Ed Sullivan with noise and frenzy, James Brown rattled him with raw intensity. Known as the Godfather of Soul, Brown wasn't just a performer, he was a hurricane in motion. Every appearance came with sweat-soaked energy, dazzling footwork, and vocals that felt more like fire than song. To millions of fans, this was genius. To Ed Sullivan, it was chaos. Sullivan valued restraint. He liked artists polished, professional, and safe for family viewing. Brown was the opposite. When he hit the stage, he split, spun, dropped to his knees, and screamed into the microphone like a man possessed. He wore shimmering capes and bright suits that demanded attention. His music carried the heartbeat of gospel and the rebellion of rhythm and blues. And in an America still divided by race, Brown's unapologetic black identity was itself revolutionary. When Sullivan booked him, the tension was obvious. Producers whispered about toning him down, hoping to clip the edges off his act. They wanted fewer spins, fewer shouts, less sweat. Brown refused. He wasn't about to shrink his art for the comfort of a stiff TV host. He knew every second on that stage mattered, not just for himself, but for the fans who rarely saw someone like him commanding national television. Reports from the time suggest Sullivan looked visibly uncomfortable during Brown's performances. His explosive movements defied the kind of decorum Sullivan tried to protect. Yet even when Sullivan tried to control him, Brown couldn't be caged. Viewers at home saw the passion, the danger, and the soul. They responded with excitement Sullivan couldn't deny. In the end, Brown's appearances were brief but unforgettable. He proved that real art couldn't be sanitized, even on Sullivan's carefully curated stage. And while Sullivan may have hated the unpredictability, James Brown's defiance helped pave the way for funk, soul, and generations of performers who followed. But Brown wasn't the last thorn in Sullivan's side. The next clashes came from a wave of rock rebels bands who refused to play by the rules, and who tested Sullivan's patience to the breaking point. If Elvis, Buddy Holly, Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and James Brown pushed Ed Sullivan's patience, the rock revolution of the late 1960s nearly broke him. By then, his variety show was still a Sunday night tradition, but the culture around it had shifted. Rock was louder, bolder, and less willing to bow to authority. Sullivan, stubborn as ever, clashed bitterly with artists who refused to play by his rules. The Rolling Stones became one of his most infamous battles. Scheduled to perform "Let's Spend the Night Together," Sullivan demanded the lyrics be changed to "Let's Spend Some Time Together." He thought the original was too suggestive for his conservative audience. Reluctantly, Mick Jagger went along, but not without rebellion. On live television, he rolled his eyes dramatically as he sang the censored version, making it clear to millions of viewers that the band was mocking Sullivan's demand. The message was unmistakable. Rock and roll wasn't going to be sanitized. Then came the Doors. Invited to perform Light My Fire, Jim Morrison was told not to sing the word higher. Sullivan's team feared it hinted at drug use, a taboo subject for network television. Morrison nodded politely backstage, but when the cameras rolled, he belted out the lyric with even more emphasis than usual. Sullivan was furious, vowing the band would never return. Morrison reportedly smirked, saying they didn't care. They had already gotten their national exposure. These moments revealed a pattern. Artists were no longer afraid of Sullivan's power. His show might be a golden ticket to fame, but rock's new generation valued authenticity more than appeasing a gatekeeper. And Sullivan hated that shift. He saw unruly bands, provocative lyrics, and open defiance not as art, but as an attack on his carefully crafted empire. Yet ironically, every clash cemented his role in music history. By fighting these rebels, Sullivan gave them the very spotlight that amplified their rebellion. He tried to hold the line, but the culture had moved on. And that brings us to the heart of Sullivan's legacy. He hated the very stars who define music's future, even as he helped make them legends. Ed Sullivan built his career as television's ultimate gatekeeper. For nearly 2 decades, his stage was the place where America discovered new stars. Yet behind the applause, Sullivan harbored resentment toward the very performers who redefined music. Elvis Presley scandalized him with gyrating hips. Buddy Holly refused to bow to his censorship. Bob Dylan walked away rather than compromise. The Beatles brought hysteria that he couldn't control. James Brown shook the stage with an intensity Sullivan found almost frightening. And the Rolling Stones, the Doors, and countless others mocked his authority in front of millions. He hated them, yes, but here lies the irony. By trying to contain them, Sullivan gave them legitimacy. His stage was the gateway to mainstream America, and once an artist crossed it, there was no turning back. The more he tried to clip their wings, the more they soared. Viewers at home didn't remember Sullivan's stern warnings. They remembered the electricity of Elvis, the rebellion of Holly, the courage of Dylan, the frenzy of the Beatles, the fire of James Brown, and the audacity of the rock rebels who followed. In the end, Sullivan stood for tradition while his guests embodied change. It was a cultural collision that played out in living rooms across the nation. He may have despised their defiance, but history sided with them. Their music shaped generations, while Sullivan's disapproval faded into a curious footnote. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson. No matter how powerful a gatekeeper may seem, art and culture always find a way to break through. So what do you think? Was Ed Sullivan a visionary who reluctantly paved the way for music's future, or a stubborn traditionalist who fought against it until the end? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed uncovering this hidden side of music history, make sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more untold stories from entertainment's golden age.